Okay, so I'm going to start with a quick introduction to the session and just kind of give like a context of how this conversation started. So welcome everybody, and we're really glad to have you join us for this webinar, Demystifying Carbon Credits. This is the first of a series we're starting where we're exploring what are carbon credits and payments for ecosystem services. You know, the latest buzzword around the climate crisis solution in international forums has been carbon credits, and you'll see companies and corporates stating that they are carbon neutral, like Zomato and many more, of course. And we at Vikalp Sangam are looking and working towards building alternatives collectively. And we're a network of around 90 organizations with the vision of finding alternatives to the current destructive model of development. And in our endeavor to search for alternatives, we started looking at doing collective advocacy, where many of us came together to look at carbon credits. And there were multiple views that came across, and many members who had just a lot of burning questions, such as how does this work as a sequestration tool? Who is involved in the process? What are the existing models? What are aspects of security? How does this impact communities and stewards of forests? And we realized that many amongst us had faced similar confusions and did not really know how to interact with this new term that had just suddenly come in. And so we decided that we needed to start a series exploring different aspects of carbon credits, especially in the Indian context, and collectively assess what this meant for the future and the movement on environment going forward. For this dialogue, we're collaborating with CGEM, and we're joined with Siddharth Davi and Sajesh Gupta. Siddharth, who has over 12 years of experience researching carbon credits and offset markets, he's formerly worked at the University of Essex, Institute of Rural Management, Samrakshan Trust, and IIM Ahmedabad, and he has several publications to his name, including his book, Upsetting the Offset, The Political Economy of Carbon Markets, which released in 2009. And Sajesh Gupta, who brings over 4 years of experience of working with multiple organizations in the agriculture program and policy and academic space. He was the founding associate of National Coalition for Natural Farming. Siddharth and Sajesh are from CGEM, Center for Grower-Centric Eco-Value Mechanisms. CGEM is an initiative that's incubated by Aga Khan Rural Support Program, and it works towards developing farmer-centric carbon markets based on natural farming, and it envisions extensive scaling of natural farming practices in India by offering fair and competitive incentives to farmers to aid their transition to the same. This presentation will be around an hour, and after that, we will open up the portal for question and answers. This presentation will be in English, although we are trying to create explorations and find more languages in which we can have this conversation. But, due to limited resources, we're starting this off with our conversation in English. I'm going to pass the floor on to Siddharth now.
Thank you so much, Vasudha, for the kind introduction, and also a big thank you to you for organizing this webinar series, which is about demystifying carbon markets. And I think this is the first in this series of webinars that we would hopefully be having, not just around carbon markets, but around a variety of issues concerning the development of how carbon offsets are happening, or also how the Indian government is now looking towards a variety of things like emissions trading or green bonds. So this session today would essentially introduce carbon markets, and we would be talking about how is this commodity called carbon produced, how is its pricing done, what are the different actors involved in shaping this markets and in also administering them. And also we would be talking about a variety of different mechanisms within carbon markets and how they function. And of course, we will be focusing a lot on some of the challenges with carbon markets and the critiques that are out there about carbon markets. So I am trying to divide this 1 hour presentation into maybe 2 parts. because it's going to be 1 hour long and it might be a little heavy in terms of the kind of terms and jargons that are involved. So maybe at 30 minutes, we can take a little bit of a breathing space where probably, Vasudha, if I may request you to, moderate a few questions, and then we move on to the second half so that there is a space and people are able to focus better. I'll now start my screen share if I have the permission to do so.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. So demystifying carbon markets. Uh, we are in a climate crisis, but to critically analyze the solutions that we might have at hand or the probable alternatives that we can think of while we are all trying to get our heads around, what are the best ways to mitigate and also to adapt against these climate crises, is to first see whether this is a crisis of natural science or this is a crisis of social science, because that would be a defining factor towards our solutions. Uh, as I always like to say that, global warming is essentially the earth having a fever, right? And fever is not really the disease, right? The fever is essentially telling that the body is giving you signals that something is wrong. And this fever, as we see, is only and only increasing. Now, if we look at this very popular that is always put in a variety of newspapers or any sort of media news reports about climate change, we could actually link each of these temperature rises with essentially how the economy and the society has largely been functioning. So, for example, if you look at these years around the 1940s, probably the emissions are quite low because of the two wars, and that is when the economy might have not been functioning well. But if you see post 1980s, right, where I'm pointing my laser, the emissions and obviously the mean surface temperature has only and only risen, and this has to do with how industrial growth and how the growth of the economy has actually taken place. Uh, and how worse could it get? So while there are all these debates around whether it should be, what should be the mean temperatures that would be good for the Earth's environment. So some might say that, okay, we need to struggle to keep it around 1.5, or, oh, we have already crossed 1.5. So now what do we do? 2 degrees centigrade or more? These questions are not merely scientific or a natural science question per se, but these are also equally questions of how the politics of climate change is defined. It is all about what is negotiated, who has the power to negotiate what. So, for example, when even 1.5 degrees centigrade was agreed, it was not really the most accurate scientific number per se, but it was a number that was negotiated, something that uh, all countries could more or less say yes to. So that is why I keep coming back to the same question. How do we look at the climate crisis? As a crisis of natural science or as a crisis of social sciences? So, what's causing this crisis? Now, we know that something is wrong with the earth and the way things are. Then, how do we basically pin down onto the causes, right? And the first and foremost, because even now, repeatedly, the IPCC reports have mentioned that yes, what we are seeing, climate change, is an anthropogenic crisis, right? It is caused by the by humans. So it is and a lot of academic literature calls it the Anthropocene. So essentially, it all boils down to our fossil fuel addiction. And that is, I think, something which most of us would probably unanimously agree to. And much closely related to our fossil fuel addiction is our consumption economy, the way we are either consuming ourselves or the way the economy is structured and we are forced to consume, right? And both of these problems, the fossil fuel addiction and the consumption economy, are leading to uh, such drastic changes in our environment through the pollution that it is creating feedback loops which further aggravate the crisis of climate. So, for example, we are hearing that a lot of ice sheets are melting from the poles. What it risks is probably that a lot of emissions that are actually locked below the sea surface might actually release, and this is what scientists call the tipping points, right? But now the problem with these tipping points is that we do not know how quickly they would actually would the Earth's climate really tip towards instability, or how slow would it be, right? So these feedback loops have a lot of uncertainty associated with, but nonetheless they are what are actually causing and aggravating the climate crisis. And of course, alongside these, there are several other non-anthropogenic factors, right? So, for example, El Nino, to some extent, is a non-anthropogenic factor, which further helps or speeds the changing climate, right? And the severity with which we see weather events that are happening around us. Or there could be, let's say, solar flares happening, or solar storms that are happening in the space, which also cause. But these are non-anthropogenic factors, and these are not as significant as the anthropogenic factors such as the fossil fuel addiction and the consumption economy, because a lot of misinformation is also being spread around the non-anthropogenic factors, right? So we need to be very clear when we talk about our alternatives or even our understanding of the mechanisms for mitigation or adaptation, that essentially we are talking about something that is purely anthropogenic in nature. As we talk about this Anthropocene, the key contributor, like we mentioned in our earlier slide, the fossil fuel addiction, is very much evident when we see that almost 73.2% of the total emissions come from the energy sector. So when I say the energy sector, it basically means the oil companies, the coal companies. It also means wherever the fossil fuel is used as a primary source, be it iron and steel, or chemical and petrochemicals, food, tobacco, or any other industry, right? And right after energy comes agriculture and forestry, which contributes to 18.4%. And one of the big contributors within agriculture, as we know, is both the use of chemical fertilizers and livestock, which emits methane quite a lot. So this is the overall scenario of how greenhouse gases are worked. But now when we talk that that climate change is anthropogenic in nature, and as many people say that we are living in the Anthropocene, there is a slip. The floor is a little slippery, as I would say, to assume that all humans on this globe, or all societies, or all economies in this globe, are equally responsible for climate change, right? And I think that is something that has to be repeatedly questioned and brought out. That no, this is not the case, as this particular graph highlights quite well. That again, it's the developed world, the global north, as we know, that has been largely responsible for all the anthropogenic climate change. And hence, when we talk about mitigating climate change, or when we talk about funding mechanism for mitigation or adaptation, it should really, the money or the financing should really come from the global north. And while people might want to talk about that, oh, China and India and some few of the other Latin American countries are now, or the BRIC nations are now growing and they should really stop, I think that argument doesn't really hold much ground, because we need to look at the history of emissions. We need to look at the history. And when we look at the history of emissions, of course, we need to look at the history of how colonization has happened, how it has basically led to the underdevelopment of the global south, on which the global north has built its economic supremacy, right? And so hence, repeatedly we need to bring in this understanding of the social sciences, so that our view of understanding climate crisis does not become something, I would say, sort of myopic, which is too centered only over carbon, but not looking at the related aspects as to how this carbon that has accumulated into the atmosphere has really come about. And of course, we are very much aware that this climate crisis is leading to a global crisis of both of land, water, and humanity. I mean, if we see, ISRO had recently done a land degradation atlas for India, and as even in the past about 4 years, land degradation in India has increased to 94 million hectares, right? Sorry, 96 million hectares from 93 million hectares. So globally, as well as in India, land there is a massive land crisis. Degradation is increasing, and also with land degradation is there is a water crisis, because there is excessive use of groundwater resources. Secondly, with changing climate, there are increased floods and increased severe droughts, and all of these are obviously having its own humanitarian crisis, especially people who are the most vulnerable, people living in the global south, people of color, indigenous communities. These are the people who are the worst affected, and a lot of people are probably also within our own groups working with climate migrants. So these are broadly the global crisis that we are facing when we talk of uh, climate change. Now, before I move ahead into how do we fix this crisis, a question that I would like to pose to you all for you to ponder throughout this talk is that if we are talking, for example, about our addiction to fossil fuels, for instance, being one of the main or primary drivers for climate change, right? Then do you think that if we move, let's say, from fossil fuel based transportation to, let's say, electric based transportation, let's say we have completely within the next 10 years, let's say we all have EV cars, do you think that would really solve the climate crisis, right? This is a very interesting question for us to ponder, because we need to also see where are the resources for having all these EV cars coming from. Or for instance, let's say if we are having our electricity, which is largely, let's say, coal based, right? If we are able to move away from coal base and transition towards large scale renewable energy, would that be a great solution for climate? I think, and when we question these solutions or the fixes for the crisis, as I like to call it, um, we need to critically analyze the social context and the social and the ecological implications of each of these fixes. Now, how do we fix this crisis? Uh, the popular three fixes that are out there today are essentially the government fix, which is more like a command and control method, or as we call it, like using the stick, or using control, right? And the two methods that are largely used when we talk about a government fix is taxes, right? So there are taxes on different kinds of pollution. So let's say there is a carbon tax, and that there would be a uniform carbon tax, which is decided as per the total emissions that the government would want to reduce. The second would be fines and penalties, which are largely there when we talk about pollution and when we talk about pollution control boards. How effective they are is a different question, right? But these are largely the two mechanisms that the government tends to use. Uh, Then what evolved largely from the 1970s and 80s onwards is the use of market fix, which is essentially what can be called as using a carrot, essentially providing incentive. That is why I use the word carrot over here, which can be classified as cap and trade, or what is also popularly called as emissions trading. And this is a government regulated mechanism. The next would be offsetting, which we largely know as the voluntary markets or voluntary offsetting markets, which are there. And the third being payment for ecosystem services. Payment for ecosystem services are nothing but they are an extension of what we would call the carbon markets or the voluntary carbon offsetting, because in carbon offsetting, you only look at carbon, right? But when we talk about payment for ecosystem services, we broaden our horizons and look at ecosystems as a whole providing services. Let's say, for example, a forest providing a lot of ecosystem services like regulating the climate, ensuring a watershed, or conserving key endangered species, or providing or being the home for a lot of indigenous communities. So essentially, these as a toto can be looked as an ecosystem services, right? Or let's say we look at a riverine ecology, and that could be looked as an ecosystem services. But at the moment, we do not really successfully have very complex because understanding an ecology by itself is very complex. So we do not yet have a pricing mechanism of how do we actually value ecosystem services. There have been attempts, but it has not really got out there per se as something very prevalent, right? And the last being technofix. So these are what looks more like science fiction like solutions. Let's say, for example, the more popular these days is carbon capture and storage, right? So you capture the carbon and then store it somewhere down in the earth, right? And that you assume would be some form of a sequestration of the carbon that is going out there into the atmosphere. Another solution is ocean fertilization, where essentially you grow a lot of algae into the ocean, which will actually act as a way of sequestering carbon, or let's say injecting reflective sulfate aerosols in the clouds. And this would reflect the incoming light from the solar system and throw it back so that we, in some sense, cool down the earth, and that the greenhouse gases do not accumulate within the Earth's atmosphere. There are many, many such solutions. But what we need to critically analyze when we look at each of these fixes, be it the government fix, be it the market fix, or be it any form of technological fix, is that is it helping us? Is it helping the economy shift from its underlying addiction of fossil fuels, or is it helping us move from our underlying consumption economy? What would be the techniques that would help us more? So I think when we analyze these fixes, we need to keep this in mind. And although I've not mentioned it on this slide, along the techno fix, I would also like to mention the information fix. Now, during the 90s, the information fix worked in some sense as a reverse, where there were, especially within the global north, especially in the United States, what we call is the climate deniers, right? So there was this huge lobby of climate deniers, which would, which basically gave out a lot of information, misinformation rather, about the fact that there is no climate change happening. And these are essentially strategies to stop the US economic growth, okay? And now the information fix is moving in a slightly different direction, where instead of spreading the information for the real fixes that actually help building a sustainable economy, it is diverting people's attention towards fixes which are like the techno fixes, let's say carbon capture and storage, that, oh, we can capture this carbon and store it somewhere. But the when we ask the question that, okay, fine, we can do this, but will it help us move away from fossil fuels? The answer probably is a no. So these are the fixes. Now, of course, because we are talking today about demystifying carbon markets, we would be focusing only on the market fix today in our presentation. So what is this market fix all about, right? So as such, carbon markets don't really have one single founding person or a founding father per se, but we could broadly say that Ronald Coase was an economist and what they call is popularly as the Chicago Boys, the economists from the Chicago School of Economics, were uh, were I would say instrumental in developing emissions trading or carbon markets as we know today. So Ronald Coase famously said that that do not look at the polluter as a bad person who's doing something bad to the environment per se. Okay, but he's saying that pollution results from trying to produce something cheaply. Okay, the producer does not understand the value or the cost of the pollution that he or she is causing, right? So all we need to do that at this moment, this pollution is an externality, right? It is external to the understanding of the economy, and we need to internalize this pollution. And the way to internalize this pollution is to create a price, right? So if you are able to somehow think that what is this price of this pollution that is being caused, that would internalize it, and then we are able to somehow manage this pollution, right? And the Chicago School of Economists basically believe that emissions trading is a cheaper and a more efficient way of reducing pollution. Now, when we talk about Ronald Coase and this entire Chicago School, we need to keep in mind the time at which these sort of theories were really coming out. This is the period of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, right? This is the period when uh, the discourse, the public discourse, or the policy discourse was actually shifting away from the big government towards what is also what we talk about in India as minimum government, right? So and what is popularly called also as neoliberalism. So this is the time when this shift in public policy thinking is happening, and that is where the thinking is moving away from the more traditional ideas like taxation towards having a system where emissions can be traded so that there is less government interference, and that uh, instead of dealing something as a penalty per se, we create incentive so that industries have the incentive to pollute less. So this is where the market fix is born, right? And one of the first major experiments with emissions trading was the US's sulfur dioxide program, which basically happened in the 80s and the 90s, and that actually became the bedrock of promoting emissions trading and carbon market or offsetting mechanisms in the climate talks. So broadly, emission trading mechanisms, as we mentioned, can be divided into two sort of methods. One being the cap and trade, and the other being baseline and credit. Cap and trade, as we know, is called the emissions trading system, and baseline and credit is popularly called offsetting. Now, if we see in the cap and trade, let's take a two industry model, a simple two industry model to understand this, right? So the red line here demarcates the cap that has been put by the government, right? So the government decide that, okay, given that there is climate change happening, and I want to keep the Earth's mean temperature at, let's say, 1.5 degrees centigrade, this red line or this X amount of tons of carbon emission is what I should allow so that the overall temperature does not exceed 1.5 degrees, right? Now, once this cap is established on these two factories, emitter A and emitter B, at the end of the financial year, after one full year has gone by, the government would like to do an evaluation. Now, within this 1 year, both these factories would have, let's say, 10 different ways through which probably they can reduce their own pollution or emission and stay within this cap, right? However, as we know, sometimes making changes is not easy for any economic unit or like an industry, right? Because probably you are already locked in into a certain production system, or probably you are not really having lots of surplus money with you, or you're not able to raise adequate investment to be able to bring in new technology, for instance. So probably, let's say we have here factory A, which has not been able to bring in, let's say, some sort of green technology and has emitted this excess of greenhouse gas emission, which is this red portion over here, right? But whereas we have here factory B, which has been able to bring in some sort of green technology and has been able to internally reduce its emission, and that is why it has polluted below this red line over here, right? Which is the cap, and that is why it's in the blue. Now, because there is this difference, so the government is going to go to factory number A and say that, okay, you've got two options now. Either you pay a penalty for polluting beyond this cap, or you can buy emissions reductions from factory B, which is actually polluted less. And obviously, buying emissions reductions from factory B would turn out cheaper than actually paying up the penalty to the government. So obviously, factory A would do this, right? And this is the argument that is being made to say that this whole system of cap and then allowing this sort of a trade would make it cheaper for industries or companies to reduce the emissions, and instead of having this sort of big carbon tax which they would have to pay. And also the arguments against a carbon tax has largely been around that, would the government even be able to have decide what would be the right percentage of taxation? Or what if there is corruption and people are not paying the taxes, right? And or that the fact that to administer taxes, government would have to go in through a lot of administrative costs, right? So instead of all of this, setting up this sort of a trading mechanism would probably be cheaper. Okay. Then there's a second mechanism below that, which is that carbon offsetting. Now, again, the government again gives a second option to these factories which are not able to stay within the cap, that okay, you are not able to pay enough money to, let's say, buy green technology and install it into your factory to reduce your emissions. What you could do is instead invest some money, which is usually the case that it is invested in the global south, where probably, let's say, you do a plantation with the money, and you assume that this plantation that you are doing in the global south, let's say, for example, in India, is going to offset the extra emissions that you are going to do. So, for example, if this is 100 tons, this red area, which I'm pointing out here, is 100 tons. So for offsetting 100 tons, let's say, for instance, I have to grow 200 trees, I would give this money to an NGO back in India and say that, okay, here, take this money and grow 200 trees and protect this 200 trees for the next, let's say, 100 years or 150 years, so that this 200 tons of carbon dioxide that I am emitting gets offset. Okay, so this, and why would company A do this? Because planting trees, let's say in the global south, in a country like India, or in some country in Africa or in the Latin America, turns out to be much cheaper for them compared to investing in green technology, right? So this is the logic for how emissions trading works and how carbon offsetting works. So here's just a recap of what it is. So cap and trade is essentially something that the government creates and the government monitors. And what it does is that first it gives out the allowances. It sets a cap and it gives allowances to pollute within, and that you can only pollute within that, right? And as generally the allowances are supposed to be given as an auction. But unfortunately, what we see is that they are not auctioned, but they are actually just given out as a gift in some sense by the government, right? And within a given year, the industries must stay within their cap. And if they are not able to stay within their cap, then they are supposed to trade those allowances with other industries which have been able to stay within their caps. Okay. So some of the examples of cap and trade systems are the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme or the Chicago Climate Exchange, or more recently, China's National Emissions Trading Scheme. Later on in the slides, I will be also touching upon how India is also establishing its own domestic emissions trading scheme. On the other hand, voluntary offset markets, the picture of which I had explained, is a baseline and credit mechanism where you set a baseline and then you set up a project where emissions are reduced below that baseline. Okay. And these projects are usually not done by the government, they are voluntary. That is why we call them voluntary in nature. However, voluntary projects are in some sense governed by private agencies like Gold Standard, which is under the UN, or Vera, which is another private entity, or Plan Vivo, or many other such registries which uh, come up with methodologies for reduction of emissions, be it methodologies for plantation, be it methodologies for regenerative agriculture, or doing cook stove project, or doing agroforestry, or having a mangrove plantation project, whatever. There could be n number of different offsetting projects for which these agencies like Gold Standard or Vera come up with methodologies, and then they govern the entire system, right? And the benefit of voluntary offset projects are that both individuals and corporates can take part in these projects. And usually corporations can use offsets to be, as we call, carbon neutral or reach net zero emissions, or sometimes certain companies even claim to be carbon negative. So voluntary, as I mentioned, voluntary offset projects have variety of projects within them for like tree plantations, agroforestry, energy efficiency, natural farming, electric automobility, etc. So I think I will take a quick pause over here because it's almost been 30 minutes. And maybe Vasudha, if I may request you to facilitate if there are any questions or comments until now, and then we can carry on.
Yeah, so there are questions already that have come in the chat bar, in the question bar. So I'll read out the first one. It's by Harsh Maru, and he's asking, what are the possibilities of greenwashing for such market? How transparent is it for public concerned?
Okay, thank you, Harsh, for that question. Very important question that you have asked here about greenwashing. So I will not answer it right away because that's exactly where I'm moving on to now. Some of the challenges of carbon markets, and that is where we'll deal in detail with greenwashing and how we can probably try to reduce it, if not completely eliminate it.
I think you cut off there for a second, Siddharth.
Oh, sorry, I'll just repeat myself. So Harsh, in the coming slides, I will be dealing with issues of greenwashing, and also some of the other challenges and critiques that are around carbon markets and offsetting markets.
Yeah, so we'll move on to the next question, which is by Ganesh Neelam. And he's asking, how would forest be a contributor to carbon sequestration as shown with agriculture?
Okay, again, this is also something that we'll be dealing in the coming slides now, because that is where I'll be talking in more detail about how, firstly, these projects are being registered, what are the methods of doing this, and how forest or for that matter, agroecology or regenerative agriculture could become a part of these voluntary offsites.
Great. So moving on to the next question, it's Anshuman Das, and he's asking if I always have a question on the philosophy of the carbon trade. Those who have money can emit more and pay for it. So I think he's like asking, like, isn't that a questionable philosophy?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very brilliant point you mentioned, Anshuman Dasi. That has been some of the main core critiques when we try to understand carbon markets as a whole. Why? Because when you have a market and when you trade, basically you have to create what we call is property rights. Okay, and what we are doing here, because carbon is because it's a slightly philosophical question, I'll bring in philosopher Carl Polanyi over here. He calls it a fictitious commodity, right? It's a commodity which you cannot really see. It's not there like a typical commodity like a shoe or a tomato or a potato, but it's something that has been created by the mind that, okay, we can have carbon as a commodity and we can trade it, right? So to trade it, we have to create certain sorts of property rights over it. So what happens here is that when we look at Earth's carbon cycling capacity as a whole, right, all the carbon that is being emitted into the atmosphere and how it is getting cycled through the atmosphere into the soil, into the oceans, where it is probably getting sequestered, for how long, and probably some of it is getting emitted again. All of this entire process of the carbon cycle or the Earth's carbon pool is then created as one whole big commodity, right? And within this, people, this property right that I'm talking about becomes the right to pollute, right? So what when we say that the government has given allowances, what do I really mean? What I mean is that the government gives the right to pollute to industry within a certain limit, of course. However, in the real world, what we are seeing is that the allowances, for instance, have nothing to do with climate targets that we have. Why? Because obviously we are aware of the kind of lobbying that big corporations can do. Sometimes governments are much smaller in terms of the corporations that we have, right? So they have no power really to negotiate, correct? And this has been a major challenge and critique when we talk about the effectiveness of emissions trading, that it gives polluters the right to pollute, and that if you are more rich, you can pollute more, right? And in a sense, we can say that poorer people will have less access to that total carbon pool, because we are anyways trying to limit ourselves within certain temperatures or within certain parts per million of carbon, right, globally. So if you have more money, probably you can pollute more, and poorer people in the global south can probably pollute less. So yeah, that is a very great question there.
There are more questions in the chat bar, in the question and answer bar, but I wanted to ask people if they would like to ask their questions directly so it can be more interactive. So, for example, Narsimhaji, would you like to ask your question directly? I'm just going to allow Narsimhaji to talk.
Yeah.
1 second. Yeah. Yeah. So you can choose to yeah.
Yeah, my question was, when we are looking at emissions, we have always been challenged, about air emissions, quantifying them, or even all the pollution control board, they don't have any resources to monitor air emissions. So in that sense, when you have a cap and then this trade between high emissions and low emissions, I think because this is a gap and I don't see that gap being fulfilled. So how can we have a more, trust in this method of, emission trading happening?
Yeah, I think, again, that's a great question here. And that is largely a challenge, especially more so to do with countries like India, like the developing countries, as it were, where this technology has not really reached extensively to the ground, right? Of course, it's not like we do not have methods or techniques of quantifying emissions at the level of each industry, but of course, we are having several challenges in terms of actually ensuring and monitoring them. Now, what happens here as a difference is that, and again, we'll have to see how India's emission trading really develops, because right now it's in a very nascent stage. It's only a policy document at the moment. We do not know what mechanism the government is going to come up with. But uh, probably if there was a tax, maybe you could claim that, okay, I can write an RTI to the Pollution Control Board and try to figure it out whether they really have installed a machine at a particular industry or not. But maybe with emissions trading, because it gets sort of privatized in some sense, we do not know if we will be able to really, as people from the civil society, question our own government, right? But again, this needs to be seen, and this is something while the government is designing and developing, is something that we need to voice out. Yeah.
No, I mean to say, Siddharth, because of these challenges, can we have that method in India? Leave other Europe or any other country.
Yeah, I think
Tomorrow.
we will. I think in either way, whether you have a carbon tax or whether you go for an emissions trading scheme, this problem will remain for both of these mechanisms, right? Whether we'll be able to effectively, accurately measure at the level of each industry, right? But one of the reasons why the government is moving towards emissions trading is because all the countries in the global north are into emissions trading, and we'll have to keep up with them. Otherwise, if we are in a different system altogether, when international trade takes place, it is our industries that will suffer. So I think that is somewhere the also a challenge for the government.
No, but we'll lose the trade, no, because like pharma, we are seeing now the government is saying we can't export carbon credits.
Yeah.
I think that's what I am.
No,
So,
I think yeah, that was to keep with its own NDCs, that is the nationally determined targets, basically. So initially, the government was of the idea that let's not send off all the carbon credits out, but unfortunately, then the government backtracked on that. Yeah. So,
yeah, we'll be moving on to Esra's question now.
I have good evening. I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, after you have partially answered it, saying that we just have a policy document. We do not have any. We don't have any mechanism as such. So first, I'd like to know, rather simplistically, what's the registration body for this, to show that we start of this process.
okay.
Last I heard somewhere in 2012 was that somewhere in Vizag, a group of people had sold the last bit of carbon credits in India. So who is the registering body for them?
Okay. So as far as what Indian government is developing right now, it is going to develop its own registry for monitoring all the carbon reductions and everything that is going to happen in India. They don't have a name for it yet, but the nodal agency that is designing all of these is the Bureau of Energy and Efficiency, which is under the MNRE, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. And I'll be also touching that up in my later slides when I talk about India. Also, the carbon credits that you talked about that probably was sold off from somewhere in a project near Vizag. I'm not sure about what that project was, unfortunately, but probably because it might have been on the voluntary offsets, it could be either on a registry called Vera or the gold standard, because that's the most popular registry. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question. I heard that a crop like bamboo sequesters a lot of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So what about, is it something like, what about something like let's say leaf fall? Can it be a marketable product?
Yeah. So again, this I will be talking about when I talk about this project development. So probably that might answer all your questions about what would be the scope, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll be moving on to Sejo, your question.
Yeah, it's very simple, Siddharth. I was wondering when I was hearing all of this is that we are people who are actively seeking this knowledge. Whereas, given the kind of crisis that is, there should have been body which should have been making this knowledge public, very
Yeah.
active. And so my question is it just a miss or it is deliberately not made easy, not made available to school children should be learning about this right now. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you on that. Now, again, this is the funny contradiction about carbon markets or voluntary offsets and all. On one hand, they claim that all this is publicly available information, right? So it's very easy for any one of us to go on a UNFCCC website and see what sort of CDM projects are out there, or for anybody to go on a Vera website and see what projects, what methodologies, everything. It's all there. Each project is listed and it's publicly available for us to view on each of these websites, right? So in that sense, this information is right there. It's there in public domain, very easy to access. However, here comes the contradiction that the way the information is put, it is very opaque, right? So I'll be talking later on now in my slide about a variety of concepts. Let's say additionality. Is there permanence? This is the methodology called VM0042. These are the DOEs. This is the DNA. So there is this whole jargon out there, right? This whole web that we need to really navigate. Although actually, when you break each term, you'd say that, oh, this is so simple. This is commonsensical. But they are so off-putting, if I may say so, that even the people with very good technical know-how tend to just stay away from it. That, oh no, I don't want to break my head over this. So I think that is the contradiction, and that is also, I would say, how largely neoliberal markets work. So there is this sense of transparency, there's this sense of things being out there in public domain, but yet it remains so inaccessible to all of us.
Yeah, thank you. We'll be moving on to Suhastai's question. Suhastai, do you want to ask? Okay, Suhastai, in case she doesn't ask, I'll ask her question, which is, what do you think of the monetary compensation to farmers in India by some transnational based in another continent to be called carbon neutral?
Yeah. So again, this is a very interesting question, something that will be coming in the next slide. So I'll be talking in detail about how these transnational transactions really happen and what are the problems. Yeah.
Ganesh, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Siddharth, for this insights. The earlier slide of cap and trade and the current slide of voluntary offset markets.
Yeah.
How have you seen the companies play? Because there is one place wherein it's a very like a restriction-based mechanism, and the second is wherein you're voluntarily trying to work on. So how have you seen the companies, the large private players playing in this space?
Okay, so as far as the companies that are out there, let's say in the EU or in the United States, for example, and now also in China, because they have a mandatory emissions trading scheme, they first have to trade there, right? And generally, what the emissions trading scheme expects you to work around is what they call is your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Okay, now what are your scope 1 emissions? Scope 1 emissions are basically your direct emissions, which happen from your actual economic activity. Let's say, because I'm producing shoes or some leather products or whatever emission is coming out of my chimney directly is called my scope 1 emission, right? And this is something that gets covered in the emissions trading scheme, which is mandatory. Okay. Then comes your scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are basically, let's say, because I have to run these big factories that I own now as a company or my offices, I obviously have to take power from somewhere, right? So I might be taking power from a coal-fired power plant or from a nuclear plant or whatever, XYZ. These emissions are also then calculated. This becomes my scope 2 emissions. Okay. So these are the two main sort of emissions that are covered under the cap and trade, which the companies have to. So cap and trade works for companies wherever there is an emission trading scheme, be it EU, be it China, be it the US, and eventually maybe in some maybe a year's time, probably in India, right? And then comes the scope 3 emissions, emissions which are basically outside your scope, but they are within your value chain. Let's say I have a transport, right? I have outsourced my transportation of my product to the store through some transportation company. Now, obviously, that whatever is being emitted by those trucks or those trailers or whatever is not in my hand to be able to reduce, right? So I have to just outsource this part of transportation. That becomes scope 3. And generally, the scope 3 is what is being getting offset, as it were, in the voluntary markets. Okay. Also, having said that, while the scope 1 and scope 2 are the main focus of cap and trade, of course, still the scope 1 and 2 are also being offset by companies in the global south. So that is how companies are basically working around this.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we'll move on to Rohit's question.
Yeah.
Rohit, do you want to ask that question yourself? Or? Okay, in case he does not, he said, is this at any point where carbon stock met saturation point?
Sorry, can you please repeat?
Is this at any point where carbon stock met saturation point? I think he must have meant it contextually, so I'm hoping he can explain, but if not.
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear right at the moment of the question really, but my assumption of what you just read probably is that will the carbon pool get saturated in some sense, if I'm right? And I think the experience so far with carbon markets, if you see all these years, all the time from the Kyoto Protocol until now, has been that they haven't largely been very effective when it comes to staying within the cap, or because, for example, reasons being, let's say governments have handed out allowances without any actual scientific targets for them, right? Because of the sort of lobbying that corporations do. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So then I think Yogesh had a question. So if Yogesh would like to ask that question,
Yeah. Thank you, Siddharth. So my question comes from the background where countries have made some commitments of emission reduction, and we are talking about voluntary carbon markets. So my question is like, say, suppose through some sequestration initiatives, carbon pool is created in country A, right? And these carbon credits are sold to an industry which is in country B.
Yeah.
So in this scenario, at the national level, which country, the A which creates the carbon pool, or B which buys the carbon credits, accounts it for at the country level?
Yeah, I think this is again a very great question, Yogesh. This is where the problem of double counting comes, which again we'll be talking a little bit in detail, but I'll just answer you very quickly. Is that in this scenario, as of yet, we do not really have a mechanism per se until now, because the global south didn't really have to take nationally determined commitments towards what they would reduce, right? So all the offsets that were being sent out to country B were actually counted for country B until now, right? But now, obviously, the scenario has changed, that now even country like India has got its target, which is now it has pledged for, right? Now, in this scenario, and that is why, if you might have seen recently, the government of India for some time announced that, oh, we will stop all the offsets going out of this country. Why was this? This was because it wanted to keep these offsets for itself, right? For its own targets, right? But of course, it quickly understood the economic backlash of doing so. So they had to retrieve back from that position, saying that, no, we are not going to do that. Let's continue that offset trading the way it is. We will come up with our own system so that we can account for what we are reducing personally. This offset thing will be counted separate. We will not count it as our own emission reduction. Let it be counted for country B, that particular company or industry, whichever is buying the offset. But of course, there is a risk of double counting here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Tamara, yours is the last one.
Yeah, mine is just a comment, and I think Siddhartha, you'll be probably going through this later, so I don't want to take too much time. But in my experience, I was part of this market in 2005, etc. As part of the Kyoto Protocol stuff and all the regulations associated with that, we used to have renewable energy projects in India where we sold to the EU ETS, and there were various things that went on there. The gold standard the voluntary gold standard had just come out, etc., etc. And at that time, the most critical barrier, which I see even today, was monitoring and verification.
Yeah.
For grassroots communities, for the ones who are actually doing the work.
True.
And so you always need the support of very large companies and other things in order that monitoring and verification happens, which is a very critical part of the system to avoid all these things like you're saying, double counting, corruption, etc., etc., etc. Also, carbon in itself, we've sort of simplified it down to just that carbon molecule, but it's a lot more than that, right? It's carbon moves through the ecosystem in very complex ways.
Yeah.
And today we have so many methodologies out there that count the way carbon is sequestered or emissions reductions are achieved, etc., etc. So that also complicates this whole process. I'm actually working with a group right now where we're trying to see whether blockchain can be used instead of for MRV stuff, instead of using actual human intervention. So that simplifies makes the whole process less expensive, especially for the grassroots communities, and they actually see a lot more of that purchasing power with their carbon credit, so that they can actually use it for work on the ground to have regenerative ecosystems, etc., and keep them in balance, rather than constantly striving towards the MRV part of these projects rather than what's actually happening on the ground. That was just my very quick comment. Thanks.
No, thank you, Sir Tamra, for that. I mean, what you pointed out is absolutely like spot on, and that's exactly what I'll be now talking about in this coming slides about the challenges of these sort of complexities of the science, the challenges for communities wanting to probably develop projects, or for smaller NGOs to develop this project, and also this accounting issues that are out there, and probably how that they can be navigated at all, if at all. So yeah, I'll definitely now move ahead with those. Vasudha, should I move ahead now?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. It's a big market out there. So in 2022, it was a $317 million market, and so it was $106 million, sorry. And by 2027, it is projected to be $317 million market. And this, I'm talking only about the credit trading platform alone, right? Which, when I say the credit trading platform alone, I mean, just like you have stock market, there are these trading platform markets for doing the trade of carbon, right? And overall, when we talk about the overall carbon markets, which is basically everything, the emissions trading schemes, the offset market, everything that gets traded on off the counter, on the counter, or through the exchanges, and everything is going to be a $50 billion market by 2030. So, and the way the nature of how this economy is centered around carbon, essentially these markets are only bound to grow. So, what is this carbon credit commodity, right? How does it get produced, and what is it all about? So again, very basic elementary primary school science, and we'll just revisit that very quickly. We know that there are different kinds of greenhouse gases, right? So there is carbon dioxide, there is methane, there is nitrous oxide, there is perfluorocarbons, there is hydrofluorocarbons. So there are all of these different greenhouse gases out there in the atmosphere, right? And each of these greenhouse gases have different capacities of warming the atmosphere. Okay, but for the sake of doing a trade, to be able to create a commodity called carbon that can be traded across, we need to find this common denominator amongst all of these, right? So the common denominator that was found was carbon, and so all of these greenhouse gases are converted to the global warming potential of carbon. So that is why if you read a lot of these reports, or they might say that what was sequestered or what was offset. So what was offset was, say, let's say, for example, 200 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, it is not 200 tons of carbon dioxide, 200 carbon dioxide tons of equivalent, right? So basically, all the gases that were offset or probably traded or whatever, they were equated against carbon dioxide, so that for the simplicity of understanding. Okay, so I'll give you an example. For example, 1 ton of HFC 23, which is hydrofluorocarbon 23, which is essentially a byproduct when you produce refrigerant gases like R11, R12. When you reduce 1 ton of HFC 23, it is equivalent to 11,700 tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, let me take this example a little further so that you understand the trading implications of what it means when we trade carbon. Okay, so when this carbon markets and the Kyoto Protocol really kicked off, and when the much touted clean development mechanism, or what was in short called the CDM, started around the globe, one of the first projects to be registered in India for a CDM or an offsetting project was reduction of HFC 23. Okay, and the first project was in Gujarat, where we had a company that was producing hydrofluorocarbons, and it basically got this investment from Japan, where the Japanese company gave them the technology to cut down HFC 23. Okay, now what happened as a result was, because that technology was cutting down HFC 23, the company that had this carbon project in India was every time reducing, for 1 ton, reducing 11,700 tons of CO2. Now, if the price of carbon, let's say in the market, was $10, for example, so then every time 1 ton of HFC 23 is reduced, what the company is making is essentially $1,17,000, right? If the price is $10. Okay, so what happened, which is sort of in some sense comic, that one of the other fluorocarbon companies in India, which was SRF Limited, which is based in Rajasthan, said that carbon has been such a good business for us that now we are able to take the money earned from this carbon business and invest it into our core business. What is that core business? The core business is obviously producing more refrigerant gas. So, right, so this was the sort of perverse incentives that sometimes get created because of these equivalences and abstractions that are created to produce a commodity. So this was just to give an example of how this commodity is basically produced and what sort of things can happen. So a certified emission reduction basically refers to a reduction in the greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas emissions, and a carbon credit, one carbon credit. And when does it really become an emission reduction? When it gets certified by some agency, right? So whether be the gold standard certifying it, or be Vera certifying it, or whether tomorrow, if the Indian government has its own register and it certifies, right? So that becomes a certified emission reduction. And each CER is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? Now, what is a carbon credit? It's nothing else, but it's a transferable instrument certified by government or independent certification body. So essentially, it is this CER, this certified emission reduction, when it becomes a transferable instrument, it is called a carbon credit. That's it. That's the only difference. But of course, colloquially, informally, we use this certified emission reduction and carbon credit interchangeably, okay, which doesn't really make a difference. When we talk about carbon offsets, right? Now, when we talk about emissions trading schemes, all certified emission reductions are the same. There are no major differences. But when we talk about carbon offsets, there are 3 interesting differences that we need to keep in mind for offset. One is a reduction, an offset which is a reduction. So let's say we come up with an energy efficiency program. So let's say, for example, a cook stove program, right? So earlier, let's say a village community was cooking their food using firewood, and that was obviously creating, let's say, X tons of carbon emission. Now, because of a carbon offsetting intervention, they have an improved cook stove that has been given to them, and they are now able to cook with much lesser emission. So this becomes a carbon reduction, right? Energy. Or let's say if in a city you have regular light bulbs for lighting the streets, and now suddenly because of a carbon project, the municipality of a city is able to replace those old light bulbs with LED light bulbs. This becomes a carbon reduction project, right? Because it's an energy efficiency project. Uh, then the second category of offsets would be an avoidance. So let's say you invest into a big wind farm or a big solar plant. Those become avoidances, okay? Because earlier the power or the electricity could have probably come from a coal-fired plant or from a nuclear plant or from probably a big hydro project, which might have been very ecologically damaging. Now, instead of that, because of this carbon offsetting project, there is no need to build this extra coal-fired plant, but the energy is coming from a cleaner source, which could be a big wind farm or a solar farm. So those are avoidances. And the last category of offsets would be removals, where we are not just reducing by creating some sort of an energy and efficiency, nor are we just avoiding by having, let's say, cleaner energy production, let's say through solar, but we are actually taking the carbon which is out there in the atmosphere, sucking it up and sequestering it in the soil, for instance, be it through, let's say, a forestry project, or be it through it a regenerative agriculture project or an agroforestry project, right? So these are removals. So it actually removes what would have been in the atmosphere. Now, if we look at these three categories in terms of the value that they generate, then obviously reduction-based offsets generally generate the least value in terms of the price of carbon. Avoidances probably could give you slightly better price because you are having a very green project and you are avoiding a creation of let's say a coal-fired plant. Okay, but removals give you the highest possible value because you're not only reducing or avoiding, but you are actually removing the carbon in the atmosphere and sequestering it into the soil, right? So these are the three different categories of carbon offsets. Now, let me talk a little bit in detail about producing a carbon credit, and that is where probably some of the earlier questions that we were asked in the about 5-10 minutes ago should be answered. What is the process of carbon production? And here I'm going to talk about obviously the carbon offset, right? So the first and important stage of the whole thing is the project design. So this is where project developers, which are out there, approach communities, or sometimes they approach grassroots NGOs to develop a carbon project. Now, this carbon project, like we mentioned, could be anything. It could be an improved cook stove project. It could be some sort of a plantation project. It could be some sort of an agroforestry project. And nowadays, what is more in demand is something sort of a regenerative or a natural farming project. Okay, it could be any of these projects. So they approach the community, they approach the local NGOs or a farmer producer organization, and they come up with a project design, right? So this includes creating a project concept, then understanding what sort of methodology would be used to account for the carbon that might probably be reduced or avoided or sequestered to the project, right? And like I mentioned earlier, these methodologies are publicly available. However, they are very technical in nature. So that is where the barrier gets created, right? And of course, a very important part, which is often ignored, please keep this in mind, this is often ignored, is free and prior informed consent, which is through the stakeholder consultations over here. So it has been observed, for example, in a lot of CDM projects, which myself I have researched on the ground in India, where no stakeholder consultations have actually happened. And yet the project design documents have written stakeholder consultations, right? So these are some of the challenges out there, right? That there is no free and prior informed consent. Communities don't even know what they have really signed up for. So all that they get to know is that there is some sort of carbon project happening, and all you have to do is plant these saplings and you will get some money. But they don't know what is this carbon market, how is their carbon going to be calculated, who is it going to be sold to, what will be the price of carbon, at what volumes will be this carbon sold, and how did this project developer arrive to this X amount, which would be paid to them, right? So there is these challenges that are there when we talk about designing the project. Okay, so once this project gets designed and they create what they call is a project design document, which is in short sometimes called a PDD. This PDD is then sent for registration to the registry, right? It could be sent to a registry called Gold Standard. It could be sent to a registry called Vera. On nowadays, there are more newer registries coming up like Plan Vivo, for instance. These documents are sent there. Once these documents are sent to this registry, the registry has a thorough look at all the details that are there in the project design document, be it about the methodology, be it about the project, be it about the total number of carbon that will be sequestered, blah, 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 right? And based on that, then the project design document is then analyzed by a third party auditor, okay? And then it is said that, okay, everything is in place, now the project can be registered. Now this process itself, from basically starting from a project concept to writing a project design document to actually getting this project registered, could take anything like probably almost more than 1.5 years or probably 2 years, right? This is a fairly long process. Once this process is done and on ground, the project implementation begins. So, and this is where, which was the last question about this monitoring, reporting, and verification begins. Now, with projects that are simpler in nature, let's say, for example, setting up a wind farm or a solar farm, monitoring, reporting, and verification is not so complex because we know how many megawatts, for example, or how many kilowatts, let's say, for example, one windmill is going to produce, right? And then you multiply that with the total number of windmills that are out there in this particular farm. So that gives you the total energy that is produced, and that you minus it against the total, let's say, the coal-powered emissions that you're going to displace or the diesel-based emissions that you're going to displace, and that gives you the emission reduction, right? So it is more straightforward, let's say, for example, in an energy project. But when we are talking about things like forestry, or when we are talking about agroecology, or when we are talking about regenerative agriculture, this becomes very complex because soils function in a very complex. So what is being measured right now? Okay, so when we are talking about any form of an agroforestry or land-based project, what we are essentially measuring is the carbon that gets sequestered into the soil, which is often called as the soil organic carbon or the SOC, right? And the whole, because if you see in the earlier slides that we talked about in our introduction, that land degradation is a major problem. Now, what has this land degradation caused? That basically the soil organic carbon in our soils has drastically fallen, right? So we have so degraded soil that probably the soil organic carbon in a lot of soils is below 1, right? And this needs to be increased so that the quality of soil improves, so that the fertility of soil improves, so that its water retention capacity is improved, its moisture holding capacity is improved, right? So essentially, soil organic carbon is measured when we talk about agroforestry project or a regenerative agriculture project. However, this is a very complex monitoring because the way soil in the carbon in the soil gets sequestered changes as per the kind of crops, as per the kind of practices that are in place, let's say, for example, intercropping or mixed cropping or usage of drip irrigation or the amount of tillage that has been reduced or whether mulching is being done or not. A variety of factors influence how much carbon will be stored. Hence, the monitoring, reporting, and verification gets even more complex. So, for example, with these sort of projects, what needs to be done is that there have to be these complex algorithms that have to be developed as per the crops, as per the ecological zone where the agriculture is being done, for instance. And then using remote sensing technologies, these practices are being monitored, whether mulching is being done, or if somebody says that we are going to do border plantation around our farms, is that being done? If intercropping is being done, or whether mixed cropping is being done, to what extent it is being done. All of these has to be actually measured, and that is being done through remote sensing, right? And then you have to develop various machine learning capabilities so that we could estimate what sort of carbon reductions are we talking about year on year, right? So this is a very complex procedure, which means it is very expensive, right? Because you need to hire those many experts to be able to quantify this sort of carbon. Now, once the project developer has quantified the carbon, this report is then sent back to the registry over here, which again will hire an auditor, and the auditor will go back to the farms, to the grounds, to the communities, whatever, and actually verify the project, which again, in its own sense, becomes expensive because you are paying the consultants to come down, to travel. We pay their consultancy fees to actually verify. Once the emission reductions from a given project are verified, that is when the issuance happens. The issuance is done by the registry, right? Be it where our gold standard, they'll issue the carbon credits back to you, right? Now, when this issuance is also done, usually per issuance, there is a certain charge that the registry also charges. So, for example, where I might charge you something like 20 cents per carbon credit issued, right? And obviously, when you issue it, the volume is quite big, right? So that again is a certain cost that is incurred. And then once these are issued, then the project developer either that has to sell it off, right? Now, this sale of carbon credit is done through a variety of ways. Probably they could have had an advance agreement with a buyer saying that, you agree to buy X number of carbon credits from us, so that we can protect you against the price volatility, so that you don't have to pay if the price shoots up beyond a certain level, right? That could be a sort of a forward sale agreement. Probably there is no forward sale agreement, but the carbon is sold on a day-to-day price basis to a certain set buyer. If there is no set buyer, then probably the carbon could be sold to retailers, who then help you sell it further to the buyers out there in the market, right? So there are a variety of ways through which they are sold. And once these carbon credits are bought, that is when they are retired from the registry. They are retired from the registry so that people can't do this sort of double counting of whose emission reduction actually took place. So if you see, all in all, the production process of carbon credits is quite complex in nature. It is quite bureaucratic in nature, right? So, for example, if you see right now in India, if you take an agroforestry project or a regenerative agriculture project, just the fact of developing the project, which is basically project design and getting it registered and waiting till the first issuance, could easily cost you between, let's say, roughly 50 to 80 lakh rupees, right? So essentially, it's it's very capital intensive. Also, because it is so capital intensive, it needs to be done at a certain scale, right? You cannot work with, let's say, on regenerative agriculture with just merely 100 farmers, so that would not make it economically viable. So these are some of the barriers that are out there in the market for actually developing projects. And these are some of the places where greenwashing gets the scope, where double counting could happen, where a lot of other forms of corruption, like for example, not taking free prior informed consent could happen. This is where probably where farmers or communities might not really get a fair share. So I'll get onto those details in the coming slides. Okay, sorry, there was a little challenge in moving the slide ahead. Anyways, so while these projects are getting registered, some of the terminology that we need to keep in mind to understand these projects and this project documentation. The first and important terminology that we need to know is additionality. Additionality conventionally means that the carbon offsetting project or the emission reduction or the removal should not have happened without the availability of carbon financing, right? Because had it been possible to do it without the carbon financing, then it would have been what people call business as usual, right? There's nothing new. For example, why a lot of renewable energy projects these days are considered non-additional is because in most countries, either there is a lot of government subsidy already available for doing these projects, or the cost of production of energy in renewable energy has drastically fallen in those countries. So basically, they don't need carbon financing to, let's say, set up a solar plant or to set up a wind farm. So that makes a project non-additional. So in that sense, non-additional, so a project should not have happened without the money that is coming from the carbon financing, right? So that is additionality. Then a second important criteria for an offsetting project is permanence of those carbon removal or the carbon reduction, right? So it refers to the longevity of carbon sequester. The internationally approved standard for permanence is basically 100 years. However, in the real world, measuring permanence for 100 years is not feasible, for example, in projects like agriculture. Hence, permanence needs to be reinterpreted as the success of transitioning to natural farming, whether year on year we are able to keep farmers to do natural farming should become a criteria for permanence instead of saying that the carbon will be sequestered for 100 years. And this is a major challenge when we talk about offsetting projects. Like, let's say, for example, what if you do a forestry project and there is a wildfire and suddenly all the trees that have grown, most of them have actually burned and now the carbon has released. What do you do in these sort of cases? So these are some of the major challenges when we talk about carbon markets. The other major challenge is, and which a project has to ensure that there is no leakage. Leakage or carbon leakage refers to the emissions shifting from one place to the another where they are unaccounted for or unmanaged. So say, for example, a certain patch of forest is now under protection because it's under a carbon offsetting project, let's say like the RED projects, right? But because now this particular patch of forest gets protected, let's say the local communities or the loggers within that region stop deforesting this particular protected patch, but instead have moved to another patch of forest where they are cutting down the wood either for commercial purposes or for household purposes, and this gets unaccounted for, then this is a carbon leakage. So another example would be companies shifting their operations to other countries with lenient environmental regulations due to stringent regulations in their home country, which is largely being seen, let's say, for example, in shipbreaking industry, right? Because European countries or the US has such high standards for the pollution that happens in shipbreaking. And that is why shipbreaking happens a lot in India, in like, say, for example, in Alang, in Bhavnagar, or in Bangladesh. This is a form of a leakage that is happening. And double counting, which a lot of people have already pointed out in their questions earlier. This can occur when both the project developer and the buyer of or the buyer account for the carbon credit for offsetting their activity. this can also happen when a carbon credit is sold to different buyers before retiring it from the registry. So this is another major challenge, that many a time the same carbon credit has been sold to multiple buyers, right? And all have accounted it for their own deduction, whereas it has not been immediately retired from the registry after the very first sale, right? So this is also another challenge. What we call is double counting. And the last point being greenwashing. Now, greenwashing has been something that most people have been very much aware and have been very vocal about. And greenwashing can actually happen from three different ends. One, obviously, it can happen from the carbon producers end, which are largely what I mean carbon offset producers. I mean project developers, right? This can happen because of misinterpretation. It can happen because of overestimation. This is most common reason for greenwashing, where the baselines have been inflated, and they have been inflated so that more carbon offsets can be calculated, so that they can make more money out of it, right? It could also happen because of a certain gaming of the system, right? Let's say, for example, what we talked about, what happens in HFC kind of projects, where the global warming potential of a certain project is so high that reducing it becomes more of a profitable business. It becomes a business in itself rather than being something which is done for a larger environmental good. Greenwashing can happen even from the traders end, where I talked about this sort of overexposure or double counting, where the trader might have sold it to multiple buyers, but it has not been retired from the registry. So that carbon offset is still moving in the market, and everybody is saying that, oh, this carbon offset that I'm buying is by reduction, but everybody is counting the same carbon as their own reduction, right? And it could also happen from the buyer's end in some sense, where buyers might low end buying. Now, what is low end buying? This is observed a lot with large fossil fuel based companies like, let's say, BP or Shell, because they are buying carbon in such high volume that they tend to buy the cheapest possible carbon instead of buying carbon which is of higher quality, which has more co-benefits, and which obviously are going to cost more, right? So these are some of the ways that commonly greenwashing happens. And I'm quite sure most of you might have come across a lot of the recent exposes in the Guardian that came about greenwashing with forestry projects happening all around in a variety, in various African countries, where, or even in South America for that matter, where baselines have been falsely calculated, where carbon leakage has not been accounted for accurately, and also where the carbon reductions are not calculated accurately. So now I'll talk about the pricing of carbon credits. The factors that decide the price of carbon. One is the source from where the carbon offset is emerging, whether it's from an industrial project. So if we are just talking of a mere nuts and bolts kind of changes within an industry, which is going to reduce some pollution coming out of it, the price that those sort of carbon credits generate is very low, because they don't really have a lot of community benefits that accrue, because it's just a benefit for the particular industry, right? Renewable energy projects. Renewable energy projects also nowadays generate very low price in the carbon market. Why? Because I mentioned that there is already a lot of subsidy available for them. There's a lot of government support available for them, and also that the price, the per unit cost of production of renewable energy has drastically dropped, because the technology has actually progressed quite a lot and has become quite cheaper. Improved efficiency, for example, cook stove projects generate a slightly better price in the carbon market because of the sort of community benefits it could possibly generate. And the highest value comes from nature-based projects these days, be it regenerative agriculture or agroforestry, because not only are they very good in terms of, because they are a carbon removal. If you remember, there are three categories, right? Avoidance, reductions, and removal. This is the highest category, the removal category, where the carbon is actually removed from the atmosphere and sequestered into the soil, right? So that improves its value, right? Then comes the type of offset, which I already mentioned, whether it's a reduction, avoidance, or removal. Reductions obviously have the least possible value, and removals, obviously, because they're very tough to do, they have the highest possible value that they garner. Then what matters is the carbon integrity, whether the project was additional or not, whether the project has a certain degree of permanence to it or not, whether there are leakages happening or not, what is the kind of methodology that is being used, how robust is that methodology. For example, recently with I think with alternate wetting and drying, the methodology was considered to be sort of faulty, and that is why Vera had to basically remove that methodology from its list, and now trying to develop a new method. So basically the methodology needs to be robust. The monitoring, reporting, and verification, how robust is that? That also defines the price of that much better price we would be able to get in the market. And then comes the transparency. How transparent are the transactions happening within a project? Do the farmers really know about it? Do they know that about the carbon project? Do they know whether their free, prior informed consent was taken or not? What is the level of transparency when it comes to the transactions for the carbon credit happening? These factors can define the price of the carbon. Also, essentially, the co-benefits that a project gives to the community, the co-benefits for the biodiversity in terms of the animal, bird species, the plant species, the tree species, or in terms of water conservation, in terms of health benefits that it gives. And also, they could be tested against the variety of sustainable development goals that we have. So I'll come now to the challenges and critiques of carbon markets. Firstly, with cap and trade, what has been largely been the critique as that there is the challenge of grandfathering. Why is it called grandfathering? Because like a grandfather, it just doles out the carbon allowances to industries without having those caps set, keeping the scientific framework in mind, right? So that is a challenge. Secondly, what has been observed with emissions trading schemes, even if you take the example of the sulfur dioxide program, that it has not really encouraged any form of structural change. Now, what do I mean by structural change? We said that we are locked into a fossil fuel dependency. Now, if we want to move away from our fossil fuel dependency, does emission trading incentivize the shift? And so far, the studies point out that no, it does not really incentivize this sort of a structural change. All it does is very minor changes within the industrial production. And for these sort of minor industrial changes, we don't need to have this sort of a complex emission trading scheme, right? And the argument that a lot of economists put forward that, oh, carbon markets are here because they are very efficient. Again, this efficiency is highly questionable because you have to create this massive bureaucracy for just governing carbon markets, right? And so that really puts the efficiency into question. When it comes to offsetting projects, right now what we are seeing, there is this sort of a gold rush for carbon offsetting projects, and in particular nature-based projects. So for example, in India, we are seeing that a lot of new carbon project developers are mushrooming, and they are approaching a lot of NGOs and communities on the ground and asking them to partner with them and onboard their farmers or communities onto carbon projects, right? And I'm quite sure a lot of people within our audience might have experienced some of the project developers approaching them for developing these sort of projects. So there is this gold rush, right? There's this sort of, I would say, a virtual land grab happening over here, right? NGOs and farmer producer organizations have obviously very little idea about carbon markets. I mean, carbon markets have been here for now more than 2 decades, and here we are still talking about the very basics of carbon market, right? So it has shown that knowledge has really not trickled down, as one of the last questions that was there, that this should have been taught to people in schools, right, or in colleges, that you should know at least all the basics. But unfortunately, there is very little knowledge. And obviously, small farmers and communities do not have the kind of capital required to participate in this market, because when I explain the entire process of registering these sort of projects, it is very capital intensive. Also, the value chain of carbon is very distorted, which I'll show you in a minute. But essentially, uh, the value is restricted to carbon financiers and project developers, whereas the people who are actually responsible for producing the carbon offset, which is the farmers or the communities who are doing tree plantations and nurturing them and protecting them, or the farmers who are really taking the entrepreneurial risk of transitioning towards natural farming, and who are taking the risks of climate to actually stay on to natural farming, are the ones who do not get the real value. They actually earn peanuts from these sort of projects. So the problem is that the value chain is distorted. This is the carbon offset value chain, right? And this, what I have marked out in this red circle, is where the actual carbon value gets restricted, right? So it is getting restricted at the level of the project developers. They are the ones who make the money. Why? Because apparently they get the carbon finance from the banks and from venture capitalists, right? The carbon value gets restricted with registries like Vera and Gold Standard and the others, because they make the money for developing the methodologies or for gatekeeping and all the technocracy that is surrounded around carbon projects. Obviously, a lot of money is being made by brokers and retailers, because actually, if you go into the market and really try to figure out, what's the price of carbon, there's hardly anybody who can tell you what really is the price of carbon, because everything is so opaque. There is so much non-transparency out there. So this is where the carbon value is restricted, and also with the climate exchange, the carbon exchanges like EEX or CTX or NASDAQ or whatever. And what do project owners, which are basically farmers or non-governmental organizations or farmer producer organizations, get? Basically, they get peanuts, because essentially the value is locked here. And this is the real challenge, that we need to critique this, so that we can invert right now this sort of pyramid that has been created, where carbon and carbon project developers are at the pinnacle, and farmers and communities are right at the bottom of the pyramid, right? And essentially, we need to understand who is the real producer of the carbon offset or the carbon good, as it were. So can and should emissions be traded? Now, this is a big question, which is largely, I would say, becomes a sort of philosophical question. One, we talked earlier about the property rights over carbon pool, right? So probably this gives the right more to people who have the money to pollute more. So instead of polluter pays, it becomes polluter earns. Also, then there are, because you have to trade carbon as a commodity, a lot of abstractions have to be created, right? So it does not, let's say, distinguish between what is the luxury emission and what is the survival emission. For example, an emission by me just flying to Bombay would be a luxury emission, whereas somebody having to burn firewood is actually a survival emission. So carbon markets cannot distinguish between, because for it, what is only important is the carbon. It creates an abstraction from place and local consequences, right? So they say that a carbon emission reduced in, let's say, Ahmedabad and a carbon emission reduced in Amsterdam is the same. Probably yes, in a global carbon cycle, it could look same, but the local consequences of the carbon emission and the pollution it creates, the impacts on health, the impacts on economy are different. The contexts are different. The gases that were polluted were probably different. Probably in Ahmedabad, the emission was through methane landfill emission, but in Amsterdam, probably that was maybe due to airlines. Each have different consequences, right? And the histories are very different. And carbon markets essentially thrive on a lot of what we call is fatal ambiguity, which was basically termed by Frank Knight, where there are risks, there are uncertainties, there are ignorances, and more so, there are indeterminacies, right? So if we see with how soil carbon is being calculated, there is a lot of indeterminacies right now. And there are, of course, based on this, there are accounting issues for additionality, for baselines, for calculating permanencies and leakages. And there are, of course, the broader critiques out there that firstly, as we began with our very presentation, that whether this is a natural science crisis or this is a social science crisis. So here it comes that it does not address the society's underlying fossil fuel addiction, because you could practically offset your way out of really reducing your fossil fuel addiction per se. So instead of polluters pay, it is polluters earn. That is also a big critique that has come out from a large number of activists who have done very, very robust on-ground investigations of a variety of carbon offsetting projects across the global south. What has been termed about carbon offsetting has been, especially when the CDM was formulated, that it is just another form of carbon colonialism, right? Where the global north thinks that, you know, all the plantations, all this regenerative agriculture or whatever has to be done in the global south, and we can just buy those offsets from there and continue polluting and growing at our economic pace, right? So in that sense, it is also whether this is another form of carbon colonialism. A lot of people, like I showed this earlier value chain, right? So people are making money here. So how is this accumulation happening? This accumulation in this red circle is happening through the dispossession of local communities, of indigenous communities. And this has been seen with a lot of, let's say, for example, red and red plus projects, right? Where people, indigenous communities, in the name of conserving forests, in the name of sequestering carbon, have been actually evicted from their homes, right? So this has also been termed as a case of accumulation by dispossession. And of course, there is a lot of gatekeeping, that while apparently there is transparency in terms of that documents being available publicly, or that project details being available publicly, it is very hard to access them because they are presented in a very technical way, with a language which is very off-putting, a language which is not easy to understand. And also that the nature of these projects are very undemocratic, right? Because smaller communities, for example, can never participate in a carbon project because it is so it's so capital intensive in the very first place, right? And also that there is this hegemony of people who have the technical know-how, apparently, who claim to know how carbon is reduced. Of course, that is highly questionable, but still, at least in a technical sense, they have this hegemony, and because they have the hegemony, they take the larger share of the carbon value, and peanuts really are given to communities and farmers around. I'll be now wrapping up this presentation with what carbon markets are developing in India. So essentially, not much has really happened, but things are moving now, that the government of India is coming up with a domestic emissions trading system. There was a white paper that was released by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, BEE. But I think further details are awaited as to how this would really translate on in terms of actual policies and mechanisms. It has also said, the government of India has also said that it will be developing its own registry for accounting all the carbon that is being traded and reduced and offset in India. BEE, which is under the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, will be the nodal agency. Secretary and joint secretary level officers will meet every 15 days to help the functioning of this registry. MOEFCCC will govern what they call is the green credits for nature-based offsets. So nature-based offsets will be treated separately, and they will be under the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. Now, some of the insights that we have learned with our experience at CGM, and CGM has been now about close to 1 year old, not really one full year old, but we are closing to 1 year old now. And some of the insights that we have learned through our interactions with a lot of activists, with a lot of academicians, with a lot of project developers, I would like to present to you very quickly. One, there is a challenge of a gold rush for getting carbon offsets. So if you see on Vera, you would see projects which says regenerative agriculture in the Indo-Gangetic Plains. Now, Indo-Gangetic Plains is massive, right? It would be at least 2 or 3 or 4 big Indian states, right? So there is this sort of gold rush of grabbing land on these projects to develop whatever forestry or regenerative agriculture projects. There is a challenge with fly-by-night operators or project developers who are here only for making a quick buck, right? So they just want to register projects, get the issue, but not really care whether the money is really reaching the communities. And if things go downhill, they would literally vanish in thin air without any accountability towards the community or towards the larger environmental concerns of climate change, right? Of course, there is a lot of lack of knowledge, non-transparency over transactions. So for example, if there is a project which says that the community will get 25% back from the revenue of carbon credits, the question is, does the community even know how many carbon credits were produced? At what volume were they sold? What was the agreed price? Does the community have a say at the negotiation table when the price for the sale of carbon credit is being negotiated? So these are some of the challenges when we talk about carbon markets. There is a big problem with unfair agreement, right? There could be agreements where the project developers might take 80 to 90% of the total money that comes from the sale of carbon credits, whereas only 15 to 20% go back to the community. Now, even from this 15 to 20% that goes back to the community, there is money that needs to be paid for the costs of developing the project. There is money that needs to be paid for the taxation that will be charged by the government. There is money that needs to be paid for the project implementation, right? So essentially, after you subtract all this cost, what really goes in hands of the community is quite literally a minuscule money, right? Also, there are challenges of lock-in periods. Let's say, for example, with regenerative agriculture, you could have projects which locks in farmers into doing particular practices for 15 to 20 years. But this is absolutely unfair because agriculture is constantly changing, the climate is constantly changing, and the farmer should have the right to change their practices as and when he or she thinks it's necessary, right? So there is these challenges with lock-ins, right? There's a challenge with data vulnerability because a lot of times agri-tech companies have their own verticals which develop projects, right? And all of this data of farmers could then become vulnerable towards being sold to agri-tech companies. So a lot of problems that we identified, some of them are with market gap that agriculture is largely missing. There is information asymmetry as mentioned. It is very difficult to aggregate smallholder farmers or communities to doing smaller projects. There are unfair agreements. Obviously, the costs are very prohibitive, and obviously farmers or FPOs or NGOs do not have such funds. In terms of financial, farmers get a pittance in terms of the share. NGOs and FPOs only get the operational costs. Buyers are looking for good quality carbon credit, but they do not find it in the market. In terms of project development, there are a lot of fly-by-night operators, unfair agreements, and their market worldview is restricted merely to carbon, right? A project developer is only interested in the carbon sequester, but not in the holistic goals of what it can do to the climate in terms of biodiversity, water conservation, health, and the larger community benefits. And like earlier mentioned, it is the process of technocratic and gatekeeping. So what we do at CGM is essentially be for wherever these sort of carbon projects are coming up and wherever smaller NGOs or farmers are being approached, we negotiate on behalf of those NGOs and FPOs or farmers to get them better deals to ensure that they get at least 70 to 75% revenues back. We ensure that farmers' data is protected. We get this written into the agreements that are signed with project developers, that their data will be protected, and that there shall be 100% transparency in terms of the volume of carbon credits being sold, at what price they are being sold, and that how the transactions are being done. So basically trying to put it through various ways of transparency where the accounts are being shared with the farmers, right? NGOs promoting, and we basically work with NGOs promoting natural farming or agroecology or agroforestry. We also work with project developers to develop more transparent and more robust projects. And of course, we are engaged in advocacy, basically training workshop for NGOs, consultancy for NGOs, creating resource material and policy advocacy. Some of the projects that we have developed are a 30,000 hectare regenerative agriculture project in the cotton belt in Gujarat, Saurashtra region with Aga Khan Rural Support Program India. Another project that we are developing is with Gram Vikas in Odisha, which is a 8,000 hectare group project on agroforestry, natural farming, and water conservation. Also, we are in talks with Sanjog, which is an NGO in Assam, and trying to help them out with an agreement that they have entered into, which is very skewed and basically against community benefits. We are trying to work with Srijan in trying to develop a carbon project for them. And of course, like I mentioned, we do a lot of workshops with, we have done with SamGV, IMAC, and with a lot of other NGO networks. For example, the kind of material that we produce, this is the list. If you click on this link, there is a list of questions, for example, for NGOs and FPOs should ask project developers. So we do a lot of those sort of manuals that we develop. And yeah, lastly about us, we are a not-for-profit initiative, and we are grower-centric basically for the communities and for the farmers, and we help them get the maximum financial revenues, returns from carbon markets so that they can transition towards natural farming. This is our team, myself and Sadesh, and we are mentored by a stellar group of people like Apurva Bhai, Naveen Bhai, Minhaj Amin, Suresh Doshi, and Professor Sukhpal Singh. So thank you so much. I just managed to finish in time, so maybe we have a little bit time for some questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that yeah, we can take a few questions that have come in.
Yeah.
So Narsimhaji had asked a question where he said, how scientific is the CO2 equivalence calculations, given that the technology developers hold the key on carbon trading? The integrity of this equivalence needs probe.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. This sort of methodologies need continuous probing, because a lot of times these methodologies are developed by universities abroad. And let's say, for example, if we take them into the Indian context, sometimes they might not be 100% accurate, right? And that is, I think, a big work that organizations and universities locally have in terms of questioning this methodology. But this will all happen when this becomes a bigger conversation, right? And I think that is what we are attempting to do here, is to create this conversation, this dialogue.
One question that came in from YouTube was with Meenal. She had asked, why is it Power and Electricity Ministry? Why is it that Power and Electricity Ministry are going to be heading these markets? What is the role of the Ministry of Environment?
Yeah, so this is my understanding of it, and I could be wrong. But my understanding is the reason being, it has been with the Power and Energy Ministry, is because first, before this emissions trading thing took place within India, we had the renewable energy credits that are being traded. Okay, this is very lesser known fact, and hardly anybody knows how it is being done and what is the price, because it's all kept behind closed doors. But yes, we do have a renewable energy trading system happening. Okay, and because obviously it seems that the Ministry of Power has now got this expertise or some experience with trading I guess that is why it has been given to them to develop the trading system. And that is why probably the role of Ministry of Forest and Environment has been sort of secondary. And at least nature-based offsets have been given to them, thankfully. So at least that gives some scope for us to negotiate with them, to question them, to probe them. Yeah.
Yeah. The next question is Suhas Thais. She's asked, many a times projects like agroforestry or plantations are imposed on local communities without their involvement in choosing the species to be planted. These projects disturb the biodiversity in the local ecosystem and may create problems. How do we save the communities from such serious hazards in exchange of small cash?
That's absolutely a big problem, and that is where this whole critique around carbon colonialism comes in, right? That these projects are done without free, prior, informed consent. Now, what do we do about them, right? First thing is that local NGOs need to engage directly with project developers, right? They will have to be this sort of insulation between what is out there in the market and the community, and we'll have to be proactive for doing that, right? We'll have to keep a watch of who's coming, who's not coming, because, and this is what often happens, that project it's the small cash that is given out as a carrot, and obviously the community, not knowing, signs up for things which are long-term lock-ins from which they cannot get out, right? And this will only and only happen when we are able to spread the word around about what's happening, right? And that is where something that we at CGM are trying to do is trying to reach out to as many NGOs which are being approached by project developers, so that we are able to talk to them, and we are able to also be there during the negotiation, so that we know what project developers are trying to create as unfair deals, and then negotiate for a much better deal.
That's amazing. So the next question is by Sergio. She's saying, are there networks posing serious challenges, alternatives to the are there networks posing serious challenge, alternatives to the gold rush? Can we make it? Will we need experts of our own? Will you as CGM be those? That's what she's asked.
I couldn't completely understand the question. Was that the
first part of it? We can just ask her to ask directly. Just 1 second. 1 second. Sergio?
Yeah. Thank you. No, I deliberately put it that way so that you'd be forced to let me speak.
Okay.
So that I am so grateful. And that's why I wanted this opportunity to say this. I have we've been doing a lot of seminars, but it's all there in one place, and it's suddenly making a lot of sense to me. And that's why I asked that, there has to be a whole network of people like you across the country who need to be supporting each other, so that they are nearest to the communities, not just one CGM, but at least 100 immediately. That's what I was kind of thinking. Why can't there be 100 organizations like you right now? Because not just because of the carbon credit, but also because of the immediate and parallel mitigation and adaptation needs of the same communities who are being rushed into this. So for some reason, these two things are not connected. What the needs of, because as the climate change unravels, and it's happening right now, their own survival is so difficult. So while they are mitigating the survival of others, right, what is it that is going to be there for them? So marrying these two is what I've been working with my colleagues, and some of them are present here, and we'll come back to you for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eju, for that. And I think that is something, we are trying to come to terms with, what is the best way that this sort of information dissemination really scales up, because that's a challenge, right? The question is, how many more webinars do we have to do, or what would be the best way to reach out to people. Like, for example, so at the moment, what we could think of is basically reaching out to networks such as Vikalp Sangam, that, we have a bigger audience to at least start the conversation to begin with, right? And so that is one thing. The second thing that we probably thought is that for something like CGM to work, it could be whatever name that really eventually evolved, but for something like CGM to work, it needs to be very fluid in nature instead of being one organization and then developing its own organizational issues. It will have to be like some sort of an amoeba, I would say, that people could get planted into different organizations whenever there's a project, something of that sort. So it creates the expertise keeps flowing through people, as it were, and that the people keep spreading. I guess that would probably be some way through which there could be something like 100 CGMs in some sense, that there is somebody there in some organization who knows about it. But I think a lot will only happen when conversations happen, because sometimes what happens is that organizations understand that they get a carbon project, but they are not able to talk to another organization because of non-disclosure agreements, right? And this happens because a lot of times organizations look at carbon projects just as another funding project, instead of looking at it as a business deal that needs to be fought out, that needs to be negotiated on very tough terms, right? So they look at it like, oh, okay, for 15 years, we are going to get some money, so I'll not have to repeatedly write grants, right? So I think there are these challenges of the market, I think, and this can only be worked out where all of us sort of bring our heads together and figure out ways of, really spreading the news and having a network where, immediately we are able to be in action, to mitigate the challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll definitely do my best to contribute to whatever I can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
The next question is by Harsh Maru. Harsh, can you ask will you ask a question directly?
Thank you, Siddhartha, for great presentation. It was very insightful. So my question is about who is your targeted audience? Because as far as I know about Indian market, so there is very less people who are interested into offsetting, and people are not actually aware about this market. So are you focusing on only Indian market for offsetting, or are you globally open for that?
So I think, Harsh, thank you so much for that question. Our target is obviously farmers and community. That is what we are for. We are a grower-centric eco-value. So that's the first thing. So we are not here really to develop carbon projects per se, okay, but we are here to protect the interests of farmers, of communities who will be approached by a plethora of different carbon developers, both domestic as well as international project developers who come down scouting for farmers and communities to do projects, right? So we are here more to protect their interests, and we are here to essentially ensure that there are fair and just projects happening, that the people who are the real producers of this carbon offset, as it were, get the right price, the right value. And by doing so, we help them transition towards regenerative agriculture. We help them transition towards far better biodiversities around wherever they live. This is our aim, right? So we are not really targeting per se this market or that market or this sort of carbon credit or that. No, that's not really what we are targeting at. But we are really here for farmers and community.
Yeah, that's a great initiative. Cheers for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee. They've asked the value of one carbon credit in a domestic market.
Okay. So right now there is no as such domestic market for carbon offset. So basically nobody in India will buy carbon credits. So obviously it's being bought elsewhere internationally, be it in Europe or US or Canada, wherever, right? And like I said, the carbon price varies depending on the kind of offset, right? So if you have a renewable energy project, carbon, it could probably cost you in the market something like $5 a carbon credit. Okay. But whereas if you take, let's say, a natural farming or a regenerative agriculture project, it could be something anything like $15 to $20 probably, because of the number of co-benefits that a carbon credit creates, right? Or let's say if it could be a mangrove plantation, because it has a longer permanence attached to it and many more co-benefits of climate. It could generate much more value, maybe over $100 probably, right? So carbon value depends on the kind of offset. Also, it depends on the kind of story that is being sold, right? It's a lot of PR out there. So if I'm able to say that, oh, this project works with women in rural areas where, they don't have to now go to 20 kilometers into the forest, probably this carbon will get much better value than, let's say, me saying that there's a wind farm out there, right? So there is a lot of storytelling also involved, what determines the price. And really pinpointing the price today is very difficult because there is a lot of opacity around it. Yeah, but these are roughly the prices out there. Yeah.
I also see that we're joined by Shajesh now.
Thanks. I was just about to mention that maybe Shajesh has joined now and maybe he has some comments and remarks to add on.
Yeah, so we'll also just move on to the next question side by side, then just keeping a track. Next question is by Divya. Divya, would you like to she's already unmuted.
Hi, Siddhartha. Thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation. Like you rightly said at the beginning, it is a very, very confusing place, especially for people working towards conservation and also trying to incentivize people that you work with for the conservation efforts they put in. So I had a couple of questions. One is, like you said, the government is developing its own carbon trading policy or market. I was wondering whether development of something like that within the country would prevent people from being able to trade in global markets. Would the government put a cap on that? Do you have any idea?
So would it be okay, Divyaji, I answer one by one each of your questions?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I think with the first question, right now, we do not have much clarity, to be honest, of what it would do. But my understanding would be that there will have to be some sort of cap, which eventually would come on the total number of offsets that the Indian market can sell outside internationally, because of the conflicts with our own nationally determined targets, right? And our pledges that we have made. So okay. At some point, yes, there will have to be some sort of a cap probably. But again, it would depend because, for example, I think just 1 or 2 days ago, if I'm not wrong, I think it is Nigeria, probably. Nigeria, I think, which said that suddenly, which came up with the fact that, no more carbon offsets from Nigeria will be sold internationally, right?
Yeah.
And this sort of news can create a lot of market instability, as it were, right? So I think it would, I'm not quite sure, but Indian government will have to see at the macro picture as to how price stability can be maintained by taking any step.
My second question was that, it's really nice to know that if it is nature-based or biodiversity conservation-based, that it's likely to get much more, carbon money. However, you said that there is a verification and auditing process. So do we have systems in place where there are right auditors, even if the methodology is there, is the auditing robust enough to actually assess the conservation value or biodiversity value of a carbon project?
Okay. I think Shajesh has also raised his hand, so probably he can also answer this question. And I think he has something to join to the earlier question you had asked, Divyaji. So I'll ask Shajesh to probably come in.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. What a wonderful question, Divya. The last question I was raising my hand to comment on. Wherever government would, so a voluntary market have placed themselves, and even Paris Agreement, even FCC Agreement, all has given a sort of leeway to the government to say whether they want to use the carbon credits generated domestically towards their own nationally determined contributions, or to use it as a finance mechanism by selling it and taking some parts of it. So, as Siddharth was mentioning, there's another example where Zimbabwe recently said that all of the 50% revenue that will come through carbon markets will take. Even the Indian market initially, minister said that we won't allow you to export carbon credits anymore. So it's a very dynamic space where he took the statement back and gave a clarification regarding what he meant, which does not mean कि export ban हो जाएगा, but there, of course, there will be some sort of dynamism as long as government is there, I think, which will be good, which should be good for the market in the long run. On the second question that you have asked, which is again a very interesting question, there are a lot of auditors present. First, the volume of auditors is growing. It's a blooming business, auditing. If any one of you is trying to get into the carbon business, I would say go to the auditing side. It's a much better place to be in rather than the project development side. So because it's a blooming business, it does not have all the market risk associated with it. Every payment is an upfront payment, and your job is just to verify the methodology has been followed. A lot of people are there, but commenting on the veracity or the authenticity of the auditors, that would be a very difficult task, since every day there's a new player coming up. And all the old players, because they know they're old, they have certain sort of legitimacy on the market side. They charge higher money to do the auditing. Yes, market is forming. There are players present. Veracity is something that I personally cannot comment right now. It has to be looked at individual case-to-case basis.
So do you think a NGO like CGEM could actually help in training auditors and, like certified auditors, so that there is some check on the process? Because, I have a little experience with other kinds of certifications. So I was just wondering whether, NGO should come into play at this point itself.
So yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion. We'll probably keep it in our mind. We were trying to create a rating system for project developers per se, because they have a longer relationship with the NGO or farmer entity. Auditors have a very transactional relationship. So if you do not like an auditor this year, you can change the auditor next year.
That's true.
It does not matter if you verify an auditor or not. And what would be the basis is again a very interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, but also to connect authentic auditors, so to speak, or well-trained auditors to the registry.
So yes, again, registries have their own rating system of auditors. So they call them VVBs, verification and validation bodies. These are the list that is dynamic and released by registries as new auditors happen to put them there. You can write Vera VVBs and you will see a list of auditors which Vera has certified as good auditors. These are the people who are trained in our methodology. Or you can go to gold standard for same sense. So registries do this kind of rating and checks for their own purposes. But yeah, probably we can.
Thank you for that. One final, in order to understand better, I just have one final question. Sorry.
I'm sorry, but I'm so
sorry.
I have to cut you off because there are a lot of questions.
Yeah, sure. All right. Yeah.
Divya, please write to us for any other question.
As a follow-up, I will be sending their email IDs on the mail. So you can, like, in case you have more questions, you can ask. But unfortunately, given the time period.
Sure. Thank you. I understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So Nikhit, your question is the next question. Do you want to unmute and ask that?
Thanks so much for this amazing talk. I'm at an airport, so I'm not sure if I will be audible very clearly. But as a quick introduction, I just finished my ethnographic fieldwork for my doctoral research at UCLA, where I spent around 14 months working with two agtech firms in India. One of them were working with on generating carbon credits using AWD in Haryana, and I tracked their field workers very closely. So this talk was very close to my own research topic. One question that I want to ask, I obviously want to meet you, Siddhartha, separately for an in-person conversation.
Yeah.
But one question that comes to mind immediately comes from a 2023 article from Journal of Present Studies,
Okay.
where Diego Silva and one more co-author argued that carbon credit generation necessarily entails accounting practices.
Yeah.
Which means you do some kind of accounting to generate carbon credit, which is through budgets, balance sheets, debt, financing. So this is financialization.
True.
Towards what? Towards addressing sustainability.
Yeah.
So the argument is what this accounting does is to decontextualize the entire socio-economic, ecological, historic, societal, all kinds of relationships that exist at the level of farmers, let's say, if you're talking about agriculture.
Yeah.
So in order to address this whole carbon credit and financialization of environment conservation, what we need is a counter accounting as a response.
Yeah.
And one question that comes to mind immediately is, how can we go about recontextualization of the decontextualization that happens through carbon credits? And I know it's a larger question, but what I'm pointing towards in very short is, I find any attempt towards sustainability through carbon credits is very contradictory in nature. I simply don't think it's possible. It's a good step to take. So I also want to be generally provocative and wanted a response from you on this line of thinking. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Nikhil. This is a brilliant point, and I think this is a point that has been reiterated by several academicians, activists. I would include myself in reiterating this point. If you maybe have a chance to read up what I have written so far about carbon markets, I fully agree that it's a lot of creative accounting, as it is called, to do, and there's a lot of abstractions to be done, simplifications to be made, and things that are completely non-commensurable are being made commensurable. So that's a fact, right? And of course there is a need for a counter accounting regarding sustainability coming from whatever regenerative agriculture or any sort of nature-based project. So agreed, but developing that is obviously going to take slightly longer time, any form of counter accounting, and what would it really look like? There could be many visions of it. So that is a challenge. Of course, one thing which can be done at the immediate basis, while we have to understand one thing, that while there are these critiques and we have to constantly, what we would call is the ruthless criticism of everything, as it were, we have to do that. But at the same point, we need to understand that the market is growing. So we have to be at the guard and on the ground fighting it, right? And that's what we are trying to do. And one of the thing is democratizing the accounting. I think that is something that we can immediately do. But I think this is a longer discussion. We can have Nikit in person and over emails. So really, I appreciate you raising this very important point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sujesh, you can, as one of the panelists, you don't have to ever raise your hand.
No. I was some beautiful answer given by Siddharth. And we have had this discussion among ourselves also every day. We have this discussion every day. So the day you start looking at carbon markets or credits as a mode of, driving larger sustainability, you will fail among all these questions. The most carbon markets can do right now, I'm just saying this in good faith to the audience here, because we are one of the players, the most carbon markets can do right now is to be a financializing financial tool for the grassroots communities doing good work. Whether or not global climate change happens, whether or not we reach net zero, whether or not all the beautiful stories that we are hearing, happens or not. It's a tool that can help the local communities adapt and adopt towards coming calamities. And that is where our line of thought kind of ends and we start doing work. Whether whatever it has global implication in whatever way, whatever abstraction simplifications we do, if the money is real for the farmers who are moving towards better farming practices, and if you can account better farming practices in just simpler terms, I think this works, at least for me.
The next question is from Govind. Govind, do you want to share your question?
Yes, I have two questions. We are working in tech for climate space. We feel that ambiguity. I'm founder CEO of Anaxi Digital Runners. We feel that the ambiguity around climate projects, especially nature-based projects, can be removed by using a lot of technology right at the start when you execute the project. I'm not talking about DMRV. I'm talking about when you think that you want to do an agroforestry program. That is the moment you can start using some tech tools. Whether you do it through an NGO or through some other means, you can use technology tools so that you can bring transparency in terms of whom you are onboarding to a program beneficiary, like farmers or, like in Cookstore program, there are beneficiaries. So that transparency is part of the program since day one. So how do you see use of tech tools right now in climate projects? What is this further scope? And I have one more question after that.
Shajesh, would you like to?
Maybe I can, and probably you can add after.
Yeah, sure.
Comment. So, beautiful question, Govind. And yes, technology has a very wider role to play. A lot of ambiguity can be removed from the point of view of calculating or verifying what is happening on the ground using tech. Whether it can remove the wider ambiguity that academics talk about is a very different conversation. But yes, using tech from day one, whether it's remote sensing, whether it's trying to use new kind of algorithms, whether we are talking about creating a larger database of good practices and its impact on soil organic carbon and other sort of soil fluxes. Yes, technology definitely has a role to play. Even I would say, with all heavy heart, blockchain also has a role to play to verify some bits of it to the buyer, because buyers are more interested in blockchain. It has nothing to do with the supply chain. So that is the wider outlook we see for technological role. Even when we were trying to find the first project developer for the first project CGM was doing, technology was a larger part of it. And joining it towards the previous question, of course, the current methodology requires you to, link practices with the outcome. But as the advent of technology, we are looking at now new models, new techs, in which the practices did not have to be logged in. And we can directly, through some means and forms, quantify the flux without trying to link them towards practices, which is again a bipolar thing. It can be good because the farmers are not logged into practice-led contracts, and on the other hand, it can lead to a lot of unscrupulous elements trying to game the system, if nothing else.
Okay. Okay.
Siddharth, would you like to add?
No, I think, Shajesh, I don't have anything to add to this because I also kind of agree that tech has definitely an important role here. Yeah.
And another question was on NGO side, you were talking about NGOs doing the execution. What is this obsession about using NGOs for climate projects? Do you actually feel NGOs can scale to multiple districts and thousands of villages where usually a climate project happens. Do you feel trust is scalable just like that? Or just using, saying that NGO, I'm an NGO and I'm doing certain work that actually, takes care of everything. You don't need any data, any transparency after that.
What a beautiful provocative question, Govind, again. If I may say that.
Yeah, please, Rajat.
Yeah. So right now there are two aggregation points of farmers in India. One is FPOs and other is NGOs. FPO as an institution is a perfect institution to hold any kind of carbon contracts or other kind of market contracts. NGOs have been leading the environmental and developmental consciousness with the grassroots communities. So they're not market institutions. A lot of training needs to be done there to make it more apt, to make them more apt towards the coming area. But we do not have fetish towards NGO, as you put it. We just wanted a good focal point, an aggregation point. Also, a lot of agroecological practices, we can call it in different names, natural farming, regen agriculture, etc., etc. The action research are being led by NGOs, if you believe me or not. The agricultural system, the public extension system at least, are following the footsteps of leading NGOs of India. So from that perspective also, towards what is good and what is happening from practice perspective, we believe NGOs are much better, much adaptable player than the FPOs.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, I was trying to highlight neither NGOs nor FPOs go beyond that. There's a lot of private companies now who can do field work. We also do a lot of field work. So I was just trying to, because with FPOs
companies
also,
like yourselves are very new to the sector, and we are looking towards you as better mode of doing things.
Oh, okay. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, please continue. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Govind. We'll move on to Soma's question. Soma, could you ask that question directly?
Yeah, hi, thanks for that very insightful, comprehensive presentation, Siddharth. It really puts the whole picture in perspective to people who are relatively ignorant on the issue. Yeah. I was just wondering about this whole financialization about climate and climate carbon credits. My question was really about the scope for reverse engineering. Can we think about, or is it already happening? I'd love to know if communities can start charging something like carbon debits for destructive development projects, or say palm oil projects coming into biodiverse natural forests. Mm-hmm. Can't we think about that kind of sequestration that can enable communities to engage with the process rather than the complicated text tools that have been in place? And it's really a game of the tools of the master currently. Yeah. How do we reverse engineer to make that possible from the ground up is what we are seeking as a team. Yeah. So is it happening already?
No, I think this is a great question. One is, I think I'll begin with the difficulty of doing it first, and then maybe it comes whether it's being done or not and whatever. The difficulty obviously is, like, it would be ideal that, the communities would charge some sort of a carbon debit for, stopping a palm oil monoculture, for example, or something like that. But the difficulty is this market hegemony that is existing, right?
Absolutely.
And I think the only answer probably against that is we have to aggregate, right? There has to be an aggregation happening here, where that creates the bargaining strength for communities to really ask for something very different, right? And in terms of whether this is being done or not, I think this is being done at probably very, very, micro levels, like not even micro probably. I mean, something a unit smaller than micro probably, and I think it's going to take a long time until, there could be something of this.
No, my
nature.
question comes from the position of the financialization model itself as a counterintuitive argument to say it's not enough to financialize. We have to have costs to the polluters,
Yeah, I mean, you're right. But again, why did financialization really come in place, right? That is the question we need to first ask, right? So why didn't nobody think of a global carbon tax? I mean, that would have been much easier probably, right? But if you, for example, look at the history of the Kyoto Protocol, it was the US that introduced emissions trading, really, based on a small project called the sulfur dioxide program, which only and only dealt with one emission of sulfur dioxide. It had no idea of the complexities of greenhouse gases, right? And it got that sanctioned. And after everything got sanctioned, it was the US that withdrew from the same climate talks, and which till date has not really signed up anything, right? So I think unfortunately I don't really see this happening because the wider challenge forces are much stronger, right? Yeah, of financialization.
Okay, so it's space for expressing solidarities. We might consider, strengthening this kind of language.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Message taken.
Yeah. The next question is from Bhanu. Bhanu, can you ask your question? Sorry, there's a little bit of noise in my background because of my dog, but yeah, moving on. Bhanu, can you ask your question?
Thank you, Vasudha, and thank you, the CGM team. My question is quite similar to Soma's because we work with Adivasi communities. So one is I wanted to ask, how do communities claim carbon credits? They're already practicing nature-based solutions, natural farming, forestry, all of that. So how can a community claim credits? Secondly, if a polluter is able to earn, on the flip side, a non-polluter can also earn, saying that I have now, my carbon footprint is very low. So if I haven't used any public transport or so many watts of electricity or whatever, can it work on the reverse also? And then put up these credits for more ration or public transport, whatever. So how do we make this workable so that we, as Vikalp Sangam, as networks of civil society, can lobby for counter, whether it's financial or non-financial ways of countering this carbon markets?
True. I mean, yeah, Bhanji, you are absolutely right. Like, there are so many communities within the forest dwelling communities or the rural communities who are living already a very low carbon lifestyle, following a very low carbon livelihoods, and that could easily become a project by itself, right? However, the current challenge that the market has is of the question of economy of scale, okay? Because to quantify all of this carbon that probably the low carbon lifestyle gives, right, or sequesters or removes or reduces, whatever, is quite expensive at the moment, okay? So to really be able to do it, we need scale. So for instance, if I were to have a project around, let's say, regenerative agriculture in India, it is very difficult or economically unviable to do it below 10,000 hectares of land, right? So probably you need a project that is about 10,000 hectares to be able to do it, okay? Because unfortunately, that is the challenges that the technocracy of carbon creates, because it is quite difficult to measure for such complex issues like soil or livelihood, or let's say how much water got conserved or how much carbon got saved because of not using chemicals and ABCD, all sorts of things, right? So that is one thing. However, one of the things that we are still exploring at CGEM is to find ways that, where we have, let's say, open source algorithm, or let's say, for example, we are able to work with organizations within India who can develop indigenous tech for measuring all this carbon, so that we could do smaller projects. Let's say maybe it could be a small community somewhere in India, and they want to, have a carbon project. We should be able to do that. So yes, we are trying to explore these avenues. And I think it will take some time till, we get some answers on these lines. And also with the other question that whether, our day-to-day activities, can we really offset that, and maybe, that can be used to in lieu of, rationing food or other things. Again, these things need, the tech needs to be further democratized and made more cheap to be able to do it. I mean, that would be great if that can be done, probably. So there are, in some forms, there are these carbon calculators out there on websites and things like that. But unfortunately, the kind of mechanism that you are talking about needs to be developed yet. Yeah.
So you're saying that if these are not on a very large scale,
yeah,
it's not possible for micro communities to access.
Yes.
For example, we had approached a clean cooking stove
Right.
company, and we said we wanted for 4 or 5 villages, and they said unless you have 1,000 villages,
Yeah,
you will not
exactly.
implement it.
Because
So,
like I mentioned, the cost of just developing the project, right? The documentation, for example, right? And writing all of that stuff, it can cost you anything like 50 lakhs. Now, doing that for one village, how are we going to get that kind of money? And this money varies upon the kind of complexity of your project, right? Maybe a cooking stove project might be slightly easier to quantify as compared to an agroforestry project, right? So these are some of the challenges, and that is why we are on the search of trying to collaborate, look for people who are going to help us democratize this tech, help us democratize this accounting. And that is, again, that connects to the question I think that Nikhit Agrawal was asking about, this sort of counter accounting. What would that be? The counter accounting would be people's accounting, but that will take some time till we have robust ways of doing that.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a few more questions, but considering that we're 43 minutes over time, I think we'll have to unfortunately cut those short. And as a follow-up in the email, we will be sending their email IDs for people to reach out to them separately for, engaging further if they're interested. And yeah, this was an extremely engaging session, and so grateful that Shajesh and Siddharth, you did such a good job at, for me at least, it helped me understand a lot of this concept as this dialogue is building and is becoming a part of a lot of international forums, and what does this really mean for the future of environment. So thank you so much. Moving further, we'll be also exploring more topic and more nuances in this series. So, for whoever is interested, we will keep you updated on the next topics as we're moving forward. Shajesh, Siddharth, is there anything you want to say before we end the call?
Yeah, I think I would like to mention a very big thank you to you, Vasudha, for organizing all of this, and a big thank you to all the participants, because I know this is a very boring topic at times, very heavy, and all of you have been with us for, I don't know, almost close to 3 hours now, which is phenomenal, I would say. Considering the kind of topic that we are discussing, and such amazing questions have popped up. I'm really sorry that we couldn't cover all the questions, but I'll just make a note of these questions also separately from the chat box, and I'd really welcome you all to send us, email us your questions, your comments, and absolutely we'll definitely get back to you at the very earliest with whatever we can in terms of an answer or suggestion or discussion. So yeah, thank you so much. Maybe Shajesh are you around, Shajesh? I'm not sure if Shajesh is around, but yeah, I would like to thank you all on behalf of Shajesh as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
All right, guys, thank you so much, and hopefully this exploration continues, and we as civil society are able to take up this issue more actively and not feel like, again, as one of the things you mentioned, this is a completely jargonized, nuanced world. So how can we then break those barriers and bring in more democratic and deliberative views within this paradigm? So thank you, everybody. And once again, thank you so much, Siddharth and Shajesh, for demystifying carbon credits for everybody. And we'll see you guys in the next talk of the series, which we'll update you on as soon as we see what the next topic should be. All right. Bye, everybody.